The low thrum of manufactured joy, a bass line vibrating through the polished floorboards, felt alien against the soles of Arthur's worn leather shoes. He stood near a towering ficus tree, its leaves a waxy, artificial green, a silent compatriot in a room brimming with loud, ephemeral connections. To them, the laughing, champagne-sipping crowd, he was just an old man, a piece of drab, unassuming furniture that didn't quite match the decor. He was Clara's father, a name uttered with a trailing sigh, a footnote in the grand, glossy story she and her husband, Mark, were writing for themselves. He saw the fleeting glances, the polite, dismissive smiles that didn't reach the eyes. They saw a stooped figure in a threadbare tweed jacket, a man whose time had long since passed, a relic of a simpler, less ambitious era. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the quiet old man in the corner had once built the world they were so desperate to conquer. He had laid the very foundations of the empires they worshipped from afar, then walked away from it all, leaving behind a ghost and a legend. They judged the cover of a book whose pages contained the secrets of the universe, and in their ignorance, they were about to tear it to shreds. A small hand, warm and trusting, slipped into his. He looked down to see his granddaughter, Lily, her 8-year-old face a mask of worry that didn't belong on someone so young. Her eyes, the same deep cobalt as her grandmother's, darted nervously towards her parents, who were holding court by the grand fireplace, their laughter sharp and brittle. She tugged on his sleeve, pulling him deeper into the shadow of the ficus. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice a tiny, urgent secret in the cacophony. "You have to be careful." Arthur's heart, a steady, measured drum, gave a painful lurch. He knelt, the old ache in his knee a familiar complaint, bringing his face level with hers. "Careful of what, my little starling?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Lily's eyes welled with tears she was fighting to hold back. "Mommy and Daddy," she breathed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They were talking in the study. They said after the party, they're going to make you sign papers. They're going to take your money and your house. They said you're too old and don't need it anymore." The world seemed to tilt and then fall silent. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all faded into a distant, meaningless hum. All he could hear was the innocent, terrified truth spoken by the one person in his life who saw him, not as a burden or a failure, but simply as her grandpa. He saw the scene she described with perfect, painful clarity. Clara's frustrated ambition, Mark's predatory greed, their shared delusion that he was a simple old man to be managed and, ultimately, disposed of. He had given up an empire to find something real, something untainted by avarice. He had hoped, with the fierce, foolish hope of a father, that his daughter would see the man and not the mirage of wealth he had left behind. He had been wrong. Here, in this room built on a foundation he had laid, paid for by funds he had allocated, his own daughter was plotting to steal the last vestiges of the simple life he had chosen. She wasn't just taking his money. She was trying to take his dignity, his autonomy, his final, quiet chapter. A profound, hollow sorrow echoed in the chambers of his heart. It was not anger. Anger was a hot, fleeting thing. This was a cold, permanent grief for a daughter he had lost long ago. He pulled Lily into a gentle hug, burying his face for a moment in her hair, which smelled of sugar and childhood. "Thank you for telling me, Lily," he whispered back, his voice thick with an emotion he would never let them see. "You are a very brave and very good girl. Never forget that." He stood up, his knee protesting, and looked out at the party. He saw Clara toss her head back, a cascade of blonde hair, laughing at something Mark had said. They were radiant, successful, and utterly hollow. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like a shard of ice in his gut, that he could not stay. He had to leave. Not just the party, but the entire charade. The game was over. His test had failed. And what he did next would not be for revenge, but for reclamation. It would be an act of terrible, necessary love. Welcome to our channel, where we believe that true strength is often found in the quietest corners and the most humble hearts. We peel back the layers of a world that is too quick to judge, to tell the stories of the silent heroes who walk among us. If you believe that character is the only true currency, and that honor is a treasure worth more than gold, then you have found your home. Join our community of storytellers and truth seekers by hitting that subscribe button. Now, let us return to the moment a little girl's whisper shattered a father's world and set in motion a reckoning that no one saw coming. Arthur adjusted the collar of his old jacket, the fabric soft and familiar against his skin. He gave Lily's hand one last squeeze and turned, melting back into the shadows he had occupied all evening. He walked towards the grand oak doors, his steps unhurried, his back straight. He didn't look back. To them, he was just the old man leaving early. What they didn't know was that Arthur Vance was leaving, and he was taking his world with him. The decision to disappear had not been born of whim or fancy, but forged in the crucible of a grief so profound it had reshaped the very landscape of his soul. His wife, Eleanor, had been the anchor of his life, the true north on his moral compass. She was the one who saw past the towering monolith of Arthur Vance, the Oracle of Oak Valley, a name whispered with reverence in boardrooms and trading floors across the globe. She saw the quiet man who loved the smell of rain on dry earth and the intricate patterns of frost on a winter window. When he lost her to a sudden, merciless illness, the world of numbers and acquisitions, of stock prices and leveraged buyouts, turned to gray ash in his mouth. The vast fortune he had amassed felt like a shroud, a heavy, suffocating blanket that separated him from the simple, tangible realities of life she had so cherished. His daughter, Clara, was already adrift, raised in the gilded cage of his success, her values shaped by the sycophants and hangers on that wealth inevitably attracts. He saw the nascent entitlement, the casual disregard for those who served them, the belief that their comfort was the world's primary objective. After Eleanor's passing, he looked at his life and saw a king on a lonely mountain of gold, his only child learning to love the treasure, not the man. So he devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. He orchestrated his own financial collapse. With the help of his most trusted and loyal confidant, a brilliant legal mind named Gideon, he created the perfect illusion. The headlines screamed of a fallen titan, of catastrophic investments, of the Vance empire crumbling to dust. He liquidated, he divested, he vanished. In reality, he had simply moved his entire fortune, every last billion, into a single, unassailable entity. The Oak Valley Foundation, a charitable trust so vast and complex it operated like a sovereign nation. He installed Gideon as its public-facing director and disappeared from the world, adopting his mother's maiden name, Miller. He became Arthur Miller, a retired history teacher living on a modest pension, the sole owner of a small, charming cottage in a quiet suburban town. A cottage that was, in fact, a registered historical landmark he had saved from demolition years prior. He kept only one personal account with enough funds for a simple, dignified existence. It was the ultimate test. He wanted to give Clara the chance to know him, to love him, free from the shadow of his wealth. He wanted to see if the values Eleanor had tried to instill had taken root, or if they had been choked out by the weeds of privilege. For a time, it seemed to work. Clara, humbled by their fall from grace, finished her schooling, met a young, ambitious man named Mark, and started a life. Arthur, from his quiet exile, secretly ensured she never truly wanted for anything. He anonymously paid for the down payment on their first house. He established a small, discretionary trust, managed by a third-party law firm and overseen by Gideon, that dripped enough money into their accounts to maintain a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle. They believed Mark's uncanny success in the market was his own doing. In reality, it was Arthur, through Gideon, subtly guiding his investments and covering his losses. They were living in a carefully constructed diorama, and Arthur was the silent, unseen architect, hoping that one day they would wake up and see the value of a life not measured in dollars. But the years wore on and the rot began to show. Mark's ambition curdled into a smug, reptilian greed. Clara's initial humility morphed into a bitter resentment. They saw Arthur not as a father who had lost everything but as a constant, embarrassing reminder of what they felt was their birthright. They couldn't understand why he was so content in his small house, with his worn books and his simple garden. Their visits became less frequent, their conversations strained, always circling back to the topic of money. "Dad, the market is just ripe for the picking right now. If we just had a little more capital," Mark would begin. "This house must be worth a fortune now, Dad. The property values are skyrocketing. Have you ever thought about downsizing? It's just too much for you to handle alone," Clara would add, her voice syrupy with false concern. Arthur would simply smile, a sad, knowing smile, and change the subject. "More tea?" he'd ask, his stoicism a wall they could never breach. He endured their condescension, their barely veiled pity, their constant, grasping attempts to monetize his existence. He saw their casual cruelty, the way they spoke to service workers, the way they judged their friends based on their possessions. Each visit was another small cut, another confirmation that his experiment, his great, hopeful gamble, was failing. And then came the party, the lavish, ostentatious affair that was the apotheosis of their delusion. It was a celebration of a promotion Mark had received, a promotion Arthur knew had been subtly engineered by Gideon to test their reaction to a new influx of cash. They had reacted, it seemed, by deciding to finally strip their old, burdensome father of his last remaining asset. Lily's whisper had not been a revelation. It had been a final verdict. The jury, made up of a single, innocent child, had returned. His daughter and her husband were guilty. Guilty of greed. Guilty of disrespect. Guilty of a profound, soul-deep failure of character. The sorrow was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. He had lost his wife, and now he had truly, irrevocably lost his daughter to the very disease he had tried to inoculate her against. He had given her a chance to find her soul, and she had chosen to sell it for the price of a small, historic house. The old man, Arthur Miller, was a fiction that had served its purpose. It was time for Arthur Vance to come home. The party was a symphony of excess, and Arthur felt like a discordant note. Clara and Mark had rented a sprawling, modern mansion for the evening. A place of sharp angles, cold marble, and vast panes of glass that reflected the glittering city lights below. It was a sterile monument to their aspirations, a world away from the warm, lived-in comfort of Arthur's cottage. He had been asked to come, the invitation delivered by Clara with the tone of a weary parent indulging a child. "Just try to fit in, Dad. Please, don't talk about your gardening or the war," she'd said, referencing a past he'd never even claimed, mistaking his quiet for senility. He had simply nodded, the familiar ache of her casual dismissal settling in his chest. He stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, nursing a glass of water, watching his daughter and son-in-law move through the crowd. They were a matched set, gleaming and polished. Mark, in a suit that cost more than Arthur's monthly budget, clapped men on the back, his laugh a booming declaration of his own importance. Clara, draped in shimmering silk, accepted compliments with a practiced, regal grace. They were performing, and the audience was rapt. Arthur watched them work the room, their eyes scanning over him as if he were a ghost at the feast. He heard snippets of conversation drift his way. "Oh, that's just Clara's father," Mark said to a portly man with a red face. "He's had a tough time since the unpleasantness. Lives very quietly now, a bit of a recluse." The man glanced at Arthur, his expression a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, before being steered away by Mark. Later, a woman with lacquered hair and a diamond necklace asked Clara, "Is that your father over there? He looks so simple." Clara's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Yes, that's him. He's a sweet man, but he's from a different world. We do what we can for him, of course." The words, meant to sound compassionate, were dripping with condescension. Each one was a tiny paper cut on Arthur's soul. He had endured this for years, this slow, steady erosion of his dignity, all in the name of his grand experiment. He had held onto the hope that beneath the layers of materialism and resentment, the daughter he remembered still existed. But the hope was wearing thin, abraded by their relentless, casual cruelty. The inciting incident, when it came, was not a grand public confrontation, but a small, secret betrayal delivered by the lips of an angel. Lily, who had been shadowing him all night, her small presence a comfort in the cold, cavernous room, found him by the ficus tree. She had been playing hide-and-seek and had hidden in the large walk-in closet of her parents' study. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices had been sharp, cutting through the heavy oak door. And so she had delivered her whispered warning, her small face pale with the burden of their avarice. "They're going to take your money and your house." The words echoed in the sudden silence of Arthur's mind. It was the final, irrefutable piece of data. His hypothesis was proven. His daughter and her husband did not love him. They tolerated him. They saw him as a final, untapped resource, a piggy bank to be broken open when the time was right. And apparently the time was now. A profound weariness settled deep in his bones. It was the weariness of a man who had fought a long, silent war and lost. He looked at Clara, laughing across the room, and he didn't see his child. He saw a stranger, a woman whose moral compass had been shattered and sold for parts. He felt the ghost of his wife, Eleanor, at his side, her disappointment a palpable presence. "I tried, my love," he thought, a silent message to the woman who was the only one who had ever truly known him. "I tried to save her from this." He set his water glass down on a passing tray. He caught Lily's eye across the room, and she gave him a small, secret wave, her face a beacon of pure, untainted love in a sea of artifice. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod in return. It was a promise. He would not let their darkness extinguish her light. He turned and walked toward the exit, his posture erect, his stride measured. No one tried to stop him. No one even seemed to notice he was gone. He was just the embarrassing old father, leaving the party early. He stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights a cold, indifferent tapestry below. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing him off from that world of shallow ambition. The charade was over. Arthur Miller was walking away. But Arthur Vance was about to make his return, and the aftershocks would reshape their world forever. The drive home was a journey through a landscape of memory. Each familiar landmark on the route to his quiet suburb seemed to trigger a fresh wave of sorrow. The old oak tree where he and Eleanor had carved their initials. The small park where he had taught a young Clara to ride her bicycle, her laughter echoing in the summer air. These were the ghosts of a life he had cherished, a life he had tried to rebuild for his daughter, but she had refused to live in it. He pulled into the driveway of his cottage, the crunch of gravel a comforting, familiar sound. The house stood as it always had, a bastion of quiet dignity, its warm, welcoming lights a stark contrast to the cold, ostentatious mansion he had just left. Inside, the silence was a balm. He ran a hand over the worn, smooth wood of the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the familiar grain. His gaze fell upon a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings poised for flight. It was the last gift Eleanor had given him, carved by her own hands in the final weeks of her life. It was priceless, a vessel of memory and love. The next morning, as expected, they arrived. Clara and Mark's expensive German sedan crunched to a halt in his driveway, an invading force in his peaceful sanctuary. They walked in without knocking, their presence immediately filling the small, quiet space with a tense, agitated energy. "Dad, we need to talk," Clara began, her voice strained, forgoing any pretense of pleasantry. Mark prowled around the living room, his gaze sweeping over Arthur's treasured possessions with thinly veiled disgust. He picked up the carved bird from the mantel. "What is this thing?" he scoffed, weighing it in his hand as if it were a piece of driftwood. Arthur's stoicism, the great wall he had built around his heart, very nearly cracked. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "Put it down, Mark." There was an edge to his tone, a hint of ancient, buried authority that made Mark pause. He placed the bird back on the mantel with a dismissive clatter, but the moment hung in the air, a small, sharp act of desecration. "We were worried about you, leaving like that last night," Clara continued. her concern as phony as a $3 bill. "It's clear you're not coping, Dad. This place, it's too much for you." "We've been looking at some options," Mark chimed in, taking a seat and leaning forward, the picture of a reasonable man delivering an ultimatum. "There are some very nice managed care facilities nearby. You'd have your own room, meals prepared, people your own age to talk to. It would be for the best." The words were coated in sugar, but the pill underneath was poison. They wanted to institutionalize him, to pack him away like an old, forgotten photograph. "And of course," Mark added, getting to the heart of the matter, "selling this house would provide more than enough to cover the costs. It would secure your future, give you peace of mind." They had it all planned out. The final, neat solution to the problem of Dad. They presented their argument as an act of love, a kindness, but their eyes glinted with the cold, hard light of avarice. They saw the house not as his home, but as a collection of bricks and mortar to be liquidated. They saw him not as their father, but as an obstacle to their financial advancement. Arthur sat in his favorite armchair, the one with the worn-out indentations that perfectly fit his frame, and listened. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He let them spin their web of false concern and calculated greed. He was a scientist observing a specimen, gathering the final, damning evidence. He let the silence stretch after they finished, a silence that became increasingly uncomfortable for them. Clara shifted in her seat. Mark cleared his throat. Arthur just watched them, his gaze steady and unreadable. He had seen the depths of their character, and it was a shallow, murky pool. The quiet observer within him, the part that had been watching and waiting for years, had seen enough. The love he felt for his daughter was now intertwined with a profound pity for the person she had become. They saw a frail old man easily manipulated. They had no idea they were standing in the presence of a king, plotting to steal the last, most sentimental stone from his castle. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice calm and even. "I will think about what you've said." It was a dismissal so quiet and polite that they almost didn't recognize it. They left soon after, convinced they had planted the seed, confident that their victory was imminent. They drove away in their expensive car, congratulating themselves on their cleverness, never once looking back at the small cottage, or the quiet old man who stood at the window, watching them go. They were utterly, catastrophically wrong. After the black sedan disappeared down the street, a profound stillness descended upon the cottage. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, heavy and contemplative. Arthur remained at the window for a long time. The image of their departing car burned into his memory. The finality of it all settled upon him, not with a crash, but with a slow, sinking certainty. The experiment was over. The hope he had harbored for so long had finally been extinguished, leaving behind the cold embers of truth. He walked slowly through his home, each object a touchstone to a life of deliberate simplicity. The worn copy of Meditations by his bedside, the faint scent of lavender and old paper in his study, the collection of smooth, gray stones from a beach in Maine where he and Eleanor had spent their last vacation together. These were the artifacts of his chosen life, a life his daughter and son-in-law saw as a failure, an embarrassment to be tidied away and sold off. His gaze fell upon his own wrist. There, on a simple, worn leather strap, was his watch. To the casual observer, it was nothing special. The stainless steel case was scratched and dull from years of wear. The crystal was slightly clouded with age. It was the antithesis of the gaudy, diamond-encrusted timepieces Mark and his friends wore as badges of their success. But this was his totem. This was the one true link to his past that he had kept with him. It was a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime reference 6300-010, a one-of-a-kind piece created exclusively for him, not in ostentatious gold or platinum, but in humble steel, a private joke between him and the watchmaker. Its understated exterior concealed one of the most complex mechanical movements ever created. It was a masterpiece of hidden genius, a perfect metaphor for the man who wore it. Value was not just monetary, though it was worth more than every asset Clara and Mark possessed combined. Its value was symbolic. It represented the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. He sat down at his old oak desk, the wood cool beneath his hands. He picked up the telephone, a heavy, black rotary phone that Clara had often mocked. He didn't need a phone book. The number was etched into a part of his mind that never forgot. He dialed the sequence of digits, the whirring of the rotary dial a rhythmic, mechanical sound in the quiet room. It rang only once. A voice, calm and professional, answered. Gideon. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. Theirs was a connection that existed beyond such things. Gideon, Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the weary resignation it had held just hours before. This was a different voice. It was the voice that had once commanded boardrooms, the voice that had moved markets, the voice of Arthur Vance. It's time. A beat of silence on the other end. A silence not of confusion, but of immediate comprehension. The Oak Valley Protocol? Gideon's voice was steady, but Arthur could hear the underlying note of readiness, like a finely tuned engine waiting for the signal to ignite. Yes, Arthur confirmed. Activate it. All of it. Consider it done, Mr. Vance, Gideon replied. The Mr. Vance was a confirmation, a return to the old order. We will be ready. Where and when? Arthur looked at his calendar. He knew Clara and Mark would not wait long. They would press their advantage. They have retained a lawyer, a man named Finch at Sterling, Finch and Associates. I expect to be summoned to his office within 48 hours. Be there. We will be, Gideon said. The line went dead. Arthur replaced the heavy receiver in its cradle. A sense of profound, grim purpose settled over him. This was not an act of vengeance. Revenge was a messy, emotional affair. This was a course correction. It was the necessary surgical removal of a cancer of greed and disrespect that had been allowed to metastasize for too long. He was not destroying their lives. He was simply removing the elaborate scaffolding of lies that had been holding them up. He was about to show them what it truly meant to stand on their own. He spent the rest of the day in his garden, tending to his roses, the thorns pricking his fingers. The small, familiar pains were a comfort, a reminder of the real, tangible world. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't make any arrangements. He just waited. The quiet old man, Arthur Miller, was a chrysalis that was about to be shed. And the creature that emerged would be something they could never have imagined in their wildest, most arrogant dreams. The reckoning was coming. The summons came, as predicted, 36 hours later. A crisp, cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier, its contents a coldly polite request for Arthur's presence at the offices of Sterling, Finch, and Associates. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Clara and Mark were moving quickly, confident their quarry was cornered and ready for the final blow. Arthur read the letter without emotion, folded it neatly, and placed it on his mantelpiece, right next to Eleanor's carved bird. The air in the conference room was thick with a cloying mixture of expensive cologne and smug satisfaction. It was a large, soulless space, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the grim, overcast sky outside. Clara and Mark sat on one side, their postures radiating a triumphant impatience. Mark kept checking his ostentatious gold watch, a nervous tick that betrayed his excitement. Clara was a study in feigned solemnity, her face arranged in an expression of concerned gravity that was utterly unconvincing. At the head of the table sat Mr. Finch, a lawyer whose ambition had outpaced his ethics long ago. He was a small, sleek man with thinning hair and the predatory smile of a shark that smells blood in the water. He had a stack of documents in front of him, the legal instruments of their planned appropriation. Arthur sat opposite them, a lone island of calm in their sea of agitated greed. He was dressed in his usual simple attire, a clean, pressed shirt and his old tweed jacket. He had said nothing since arriving, merely nodding a polite greeting before taking his seat. His silence was a palpable force in the room, a void that their nervous energy could not fill. They mistook his stillness for defeat, his quiet for senility. Arthur, Mr. Finch began, his voice smooth and condescending, we've gathered here today to discuss your future. Clara and Mark are, as you know, deeply concerned for your well-being. He gestured to the stack of papers. We have prepared some documents that will, shall we say, ease your burden. A power of attorney that will allow Clara to manage your affairs, and the necessary paperwork to list your property for sale. It's all very standard. Mark leaned forward, unable to contain himself. Dad, this is the best thing for everyone. You'll be comfortable, and the capital from the house will be put to good use, invested properly. You won't have to worry about a thing. They were closing in for the kill. The trap was set. Arthur looked from his daughter's expectant face to his son-in-law's greedy eyes. He saw no love, no concern. He saw only the cold, hard calculation of vultures circling. He was about to speak, to utter a simple, quiet no, when the conference room doors swung open. They didn't creak. They opened with a silent, decisive push, as if moved by an invisible, inexorable force. 3 men entered. The man in the lead was Gideon. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that spoke of quiet, immense power. His face was impassive, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He moved with an unhurried grace that commanded the attention of the entire room. He was flanked by 2 other men, equally well-dressed, their expressions serious and watchful. Their presence instantly and completely altered the atmosphere. The smug satisfaction evaporated, replaced by a sudden, confused tension. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, visibly paled. His jaw went slack. It was clear he recognized Gideon, and the recognition terrified him. I apologize for the intrusion, Gideon said, his voice calm and measured, yet it filled the room, silencing all other thought. This is a private meeting, Mark blustered, trying to recover some semblance of control. Who are you? Gideon's gaze, cold and analytical, settled on Mark for a brief moment before dismissing him entirely. He did not deign to answer the question. His attention was focused solely on one person. He walked to the end of the table and stood before Arthur, his posture one of profound and unmistakable respect. He gave a slight, formal bow of his head. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice resonating with a reverence that was utterly baffling to Clara and Mark. It is good to see you, sir. I trust you are well. Clara let out a short, nervous laugh. Vance? You must be mistaken. His name is Miller. Arthur Miller. My father. Gideon turned his head slowly, his gaze now falling upon Clara. It was not a warm look. It was the look of a scientist examining a microbe under a microscope. And then, the world began to unravel for Clara and Mark, thread by painful thread. The reveal had begun. The king, hidden for so long behind the guise of a pauper, was about to be returned to his throne. The air crackled with the silent, terrifying energy of a paradigm shifting, and the lives built on a foundation of lies were about to be washed away by a tsunami of truth. The silence that followed Gideon's deferential greeting was absolute, a perfect vacuum in which Clara's nervous correction, "His name is Miller," hung like a foolish, discordant chime. Mark, puffed up with a bravado he clearly didn't feel, scoffed. Look, I don't know who you are, but this is a private family matter. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Gideon didn't even glance at him. His focus remained on Clara, his expression unreadable. Then he began to speak, and his voice was the sound of a carefully constructed world being dismantled, brick by brick. His name, Gideon stated with the calm, irrefutable authority of a man who deals only in facts, is Arthur Vance. He adopted his mother's maiden name, Miller, 16 years ago, following the tragic passing of his wife, Eleanor Vance, as part of a personal sabbatical from public life. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, made a small, strangled sound, his face the color of old parchment. He knew the name Vance. Everyone in the world of high finance knew that name. It was a name synonymous with genius, with mythic wealth, and with a sudden, spectacular disappearance that had become the stuff of legend. Clara stared, her mouth slightly agape. Vance? Like Vance Capital? She whispered, the name of a company whose legendary rise and fall they had studied in business school. The founder of Vance Capital, Gideon corrected gently, though there was no gentleness in his eyes. The sole architect of the Phoenix portfolio, the man the press nicknamed the Oracle of Oak Valley. The man who, at the peak of his power, controlled a net worth that would make the GDP of a small nation blush. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle into the room's thick silence. He did not, as the press reported and as he allowed you to believe, lose his fortune. He simply moved it. Gideon placed a slim, leather-bound portfolio on the table with a soft, definitive thud. He opened it. He converted his entire personal and corporate wealth into a single private entity, the Oak Valley Foundation, a charitable and research endowment which I have the honor of directing on his behalf. An organization with current assets in excess of $97 billion. The number hung in the air, an impossible, astronomical figure that defied comprehension. Mark's face went from ruddy to a waxy, sickly white. Clara seemed to have stopped breathing. But our life, she stammered, her mind struggling to connect the dots. Mark's job, our house. Ah, yes, Gideon said, a flicker of something almost like pity in his eyes. Your life, a case study, you might say, an experiment. Mr. Vance was interested to see if the values of integrity and character could flourish in the absence of overwhelming wealth. He established a minor discretionary trust, Fund 7G, to provide you with a comfortable, but not extravagant, lifestyle. Your home was purchased through a shell corporation owned by the foundation. Mr. Peterson's uncanny success in the market, he said, finally looking at Mark with open contempt, was the result of a foundation algorithm that buffered his trades, covering his rather significant losses and amplifying his meager gains. You have been living, Mrs. Peterson, not on your own merits, but on a carefully managed allowance. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on them, stealing the air from their lungs. But Gideon was not finished. He gestured toward the documents Mr. Finch had so proudly prepared. You came here today to claim ownership of this man's last remaining asset. This modest cottage you were so eager to sell. He slid a glossy photograph across the table. It showed Arthur's house, but with a bronze plaque near the door that they had never bothered to read. This property is the historic Blackwood Manor, built in 1887. Mr. Vance purchased it 20 years ago to save it from demolition, and it is a protected landmark under the National Historic Preservation Act. Its current assessed value is inestimable, as it is considered a national treasure. It belongs, and has always belonged, to the foundation. He then looked directly at Arthur, his tone shifting back to one of utter reverence. He pointed to the simple, scratched watch on Arthur's wrist. And as for Mr. Vance's personal effects, I believe the timepiece he is currently wearing, a custom steel Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, was valued for insurance purposes last month at a figure that would allow you to purchase this entire city block, Mr. Finch, and still have enough left over for a very, very comfortable retirement. The monologue was complete. It was a systematic, surgical demolition of their reality. Every belief they held about themselves, their success, their cleverness, their superiority, was revealed as a lie. They were not self-made. They were charity cases, participants in a long-term study of their own moral failings, and they had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The quiet, embarrassing old man they had planned to discard was the silent benefactor of their entire existence. The king who had been living among them all along, watching and waiting. The silence that descended in the wake of Gideon's monologue was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with the ghosts of their shattered arrogance. The conference room, once their arena of triumph, had become their tomb. Clara and Mark were frozen, statues carved from shame and disbelief. The color had drained from Mark's face, leaving a pasty, gray mask of horror. His smugness, his defining characteristic, had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified man. He stared at Arthur, his eyes wide with a sickening cocktail of emotions. Awe, fear, and the dawning, gut-wrenching realization of his own monumental foolishness. He had scoffed at a man who could buy and sell him 1,000 times over. He had tried to swindle a legend. Clara's reaction was more complex, more tragic. The initial shock gave way to a wave of dawning comprehension that was visibly painful to witness. Her gaze was fixed on her father, but she wasn't seeing the quiet, simple man she had pitied and resented for 16 years. She was seeing, for the very first time, Arthur Vance. She was seeing the towering intellect, the quiet strength, the profound dignity he had never lost. And superimposed over that image was the memory of her own actions. The years of condescension, the casual disrespect, the final, grubby betrayal she had been about to commit. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent admission of a guilt so profound it could never be articulated. She had not just misjudged her father. She had failed him in the most fundamental way a child can fail a parent. She had failed to see him. Mr. Finch, the smarmy lawyer, was trying to blend into the expensive wallpaper. He was frantically, silently shuffling the incriminating documents into a neat pile, as if tidying up the evidence of his own greed could somehow absolve him. His career, he knew, was over. One did not cross a man like Arthur Vance, even unknowingly, and emerge unscathed. Gideon, his task of revelation complete, slid a single sheet of paper and a simple, elegant fountain pen across the polished table to Arthur. "The final activation of the Oak Valley Protocol, sir," he said quietly. "It requires your signature." The protocol. The words hung in the air, ominous and final. Arthur picked up the pen. His hand was perfectly steady. The pen, a simple black Mont Blanc, felt familiar and correct in his grip. He looked at the document. It was written in plain, clear language. It was not a weapon of revenge, but an instrument of consequence. It detailed the immediate and permanent dissolution of Fund 7G. It outlined the reclamation of all assets purchased through the fund, including the house Clara and Mark lived in, their vehicles, and the liquidation of their stock portfolio. It was, in effect, a switch being thrown, cutting off the power that had fueled their entire adult lives. He looked up, his gaze meeting his daughter's for a long, silent moment. Her tear-streaked face was a portrait of regret. He saw in her eyes a desperate, silent plea for forgiveness, for a return to the way things were. But it was too late. The lesson had to be administered, not out of anger, but out of a sad, paternal necessity. With a smooth, decisive stroke, he signed his name, Arthur Vance. The signature was a thing of beauty and power, the final, undeniable proof of his identity. He slid the paper back to Gideon, who blotted it carefully and placed it back in his leather portfolio. "It is done," Gideon announced to the room. He then addressed Clara and Mark directly, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The trust that has supported you is now dissolved. All associated assets will revert to the Foundation's control. You will have 30 days to vacate the property at 14 Elm Street. A representative from my office will be in touch to manage the transition." He didn't say it with malice. He said it with the impersonal finality of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. Their life as they knew it was over. They had been given every advantage, every opportunity, and they had used it to cultivate their own worst instincts. Now, the carefully constructed scaffolding was gone, and they were left to face the world with nothing but the meager resources of their own character. And for the first time in their lives, they were truly, utterly bankrupt. Arthur rose from his chair, the slight creak of the leather the only sound in the funereal silence. The air was thick with the wreckage of his daughter's life, a life built on a foundation of his own making, and now unmade by his own hand. He felt no triumph, no flush of victory. There was only a vast, echoing sorrow, the grief of a father who had been forced to perform a painful, necessary surgery on his own child. He straightened his old tweed jacket, a familiar, comforting gesture. His movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of a man carrying an immense weight. He looked across the mahogany expanse at Clara. Her face was a ruin of makeup and tears, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. She opened her mouth to speak, his name a broken whisper on her lips. "Dad." But what was there to say? An apology now would be meaningless. A desperate plea for the return of the wealth she had never earned and never appreciated. A declaration of love would be a lie, tainted by years of disrespect. Silence was the only honest thing left between them. Arthur simply held her gaze for a moment longer. His expression was not one of anger or condemnation. It was one of profound, bottomless pity. It was the look of a man mourning a loss. Not the loss of a house or money, but the loss of a daughter he had cherished. The little girl who used to laugh in the summer sun, lost somewhere inside this grasping, hollow woman. With a final, almost imperceptible nod to Gideon, he turned his back on them. He walked towards the conference room doors, his step steady and even on the plush carpet. He did not look back. He was leaving them in the silent, sterile room with the consequences of their own choices. He was leaving them to discover who they were without the safety net he had secretly provided for them all along. The resolution of his long experiment was not a moment of vindication, but a moment of quiet, heartbreaking clarity. True wealth, he had always known, was not held in a bank or a stock portfolio. It was the treasure of integrity, the gold of character, the currency of love given freely, without expectation of reward. He had offered his daughter this infinite treasure, and she had traded it away for a handful of trinkets. As he stepped out into the hallway, the world outside seemed brighter, the air fresher. He had shed a great burden. The fiction of Arthur Miller was gone, and with it, the painful necessity of watching his daughter fail his silent test day after day. He was Arthur Vance again, but he had no intention of reclaiming his old throne. He had learned, through the crucible of grief and the long years of his exile, that the only kingdom that mattered was the one you built in your own heart. His future would not be in a boardroom or a penthouse. It would be somewhere quiet, somewhere real. The final scene of his life story would not be about reclaiming an empire, but about protecting its most precious legacy. A small girl with her grandmother's eyes and a heart pure enough to speak the truth, even when it was terrifying. He was leaving to find Lily. He would build his new world around her, a world where love was the only currency and kindness the only law. The king was leaving the castle, not in defeat, but in true, final freedom. He had lost a daughter, but he was about to save his granddaughter, and in doing so, perhaps save himself. The story of Arthur Vance is a stark and powerful reminder that the true measure of a person is not found in the size of their bank account or the grandeur of their possessions, but in the quiet, unseen chambers of their heart. In a world that is so often dazzled by the superficial, a world that hastily judges a book by its glossy, expensive cover, how do we remember to look for the story written on the pages inside? Arthur chose a path of humility and silence, hoping to teach a lesson about love and character. He created a world for his daughter free from the corrupting influence of immense wealth, a world where she had the chance to build a life based on genuine connection and integrity. But the seeds of greed, once planted, can grow deep roots, choking out all that is good and true. His daughter and son-in-law, blinded by their own entitlement, saw only a frail old man, a resource to be exploited, a problem to be solved. They failed to see the giant in their midst, the architect of their very lives, because they had forgotten how to look with their hearts. The ultimate reveal was not an act of revenge, but an act of profound, if painful, truth. It was the stripping away of all illusion, forcing Clara and Mark to finally see themselves, and their father, for who they truly were. Arthur's final act was not to reclaim his power, but to walk away from it once more, this time towards something far more valuable: the untainted love of his granddaughter, Lily. He chose character over currency and connection over conquest. His story asks us a fundamental question: what is real wealth? Is it the number in our bank account, or the integrity in our soul? Is it the respect we command, or the love we inspire? What would you have done if you were in Arthur's position? Would you have revealed the truth sooner? Would you have found a way to forgive? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. We believe that stories like these are more than just entertainment. They are modern fables that teach us, inspire us, and remind us of the enduring power of human decency. They shine a light on the quiet strength and hidden honor that so often reside in the most unexpected people. If you were moved by Arthur's journey from a quiet pauper back to a silent king, And if you believe in the ultimate triumph of character over greed, please show your support by subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a story of hidden heroes, ultimate vindication, and the timeless lessons that shape our lives. Thank you for watching and for being a part of a community that seeks the extraordinary in the ordinary.